Hello to everyone. My name is Griffin Smith. I am so grateful to be able to sit in with all of you on this discussion. I have been researching your various projects over the past few weeks, and it's been this wonderful, it's buoyed my spirits over the past chunk of time. So I'm very grateful for all your work, and I'm excited to hear how your projects relate to the themes of this festival. So what I'm hoping to do is give a little bit of background on each of you and your practice, very, very briefly, and then hear from you how AI impacts how you view your own work currently and what themes in the festival are most of interest to you. I know that AI and Brave New Literature is just one part of the festival. It's certainly most in line with our conversation today, but the idea of how digital technologies and AI can impact our practices as writers moving forward is something I want to hear your thoughts on. I'm very eager. So our three panelists each have a really broad and prolific and dynamic art practice, and they each engage with central themes of the festival, like how will AI impact culture and the future of writers. And our three panelists are Tomomi Adachi, Susannah Hersarova, and Jave Johnston. So just a little bit of background on each of them before we hear from them themselves. Tomomi Adachi is a musician, poet, improvisation artist, conceptual composer, and wears many other hats as well. His work ranges from electronic instrument design to 3D printed poetry. A trained neural network named Tomomi is the feature of the project Voices from AI and Experimental Improvisation. And I think AI is deeply relevant to other branches of Tomomi's practice, like time as an artistic material, the fragmentation of information, and also Music for Superman, which is a wonderful project. It's a series of compositions that suppose superhumans who have super audible abilities as listeners. A lot of Tomomi's projects complicate and abstract both the act of reading and the idea of the voice, and I think those are really central themes when dealing with AI voices. So I'll be very eager to hear more about how sound is incorporated into Tomomi's projects. Susannah Hersarova is a sound poet, interactive designer, and electronic writer. She teaches American and electronic literature at Comenius University, and her work in VR language often brings issues of presence and the body into poetic visual systems. She works with Kinect controllers, origami, and ion beams, and I think there's almost a kind of alchemy in her work as she shifts in and out of digital systems and physical spaces. Her performances often use human collaborators and partners like dancers to add a social element to these questions of digital interactivity. So I'll be interested to hear how social presence factors into your conception of AI, Susannah. And finally, Jave Johnston is a widely prolific writer and digital artist whose works hack, reinvigorate, and produce language. His poetic works explore 3D liquid glyphs, tensile audio reactive forms, and AI, most notably in his Rewrites project, which has been very impactful for me in my own personal work, in which he carves poetry out of AI-generated source text and focuses particularly on neural networks as a tool of augmentation and enhancement for writers. So I think each of you place AI at different points in your practice. You envision AI as useful in varying ways. So I want to hear from each of you sort of how you figure AI into your current practice and what's most engaging for you currently in the world of AI and literature. And so maybe we could start with you, Tomomi.
Oh, okay. So it's as Griffin already introduced, I'm working both sides of music and literature, and actually the music came first, also with this AI issue, because I don't remember exactly, maybe 2016. So Google no, it's Google. Google presented the technology called WaveNet, and this is somehow, it's they neural network generate the raw audio directly from just they learned a lot of sound samples, and that was, I thought this was so amazing technology, but at the same time, so just output or something like imitation of Chopin, and I didn't understand why it makes sense because Chopin, many people can do that, and if you use it, if we can use it, so why we don't make new sound? And that was the beginning of my project with my colleagues about the voice Tomomi bot. And the idea was, okay, first, okay, so this algorithm is more about for imitation. So imitate someone's voice. Okay, so my voice performance, it is like, so how AI can imitate it. And it was idea, and also how, when I improvise. So, okay, how I'm improvising and AI can now analyze it, and even the way we don't know how. And it was already the beginning. And yes, the idea was, okay, so I cannot perform with myself. It is not possible without that AI technology, and that was the idea. And it was the beginning. And then, okay, and of course, GPT-2, actually I wrote opera the last year with a libret written by GPT-2. And okay, also this text generation is so wonderful technology, and okay, people are using them to make money maybe, or it's for economical reason, but why we don't use it, it's artistic reason. And still, it's this has many potential, and it's these things are okay. The first maybe it's because, for example, image generation. Just I want to see something I have never seen, and AI could be something very interesting technology for this approach. It was a beginning and still what I'm doing with AI.
For for anyone in our audience who may not know, GPT-2 in particular is based off of text characters, so there isn't any sound involved. It produces lines of text. And Jave, I know that that's been central to your work, is text producing AI. And I'm wondering, Jave, do you feel that Tomomi is interested in this idea of mimicry or emulation, or sort of call and response? Does that factor into your work at all? And how do you position AI that produces text?
Mimicry, perhaps not. Call and response, even less so, because the chatbot kind of formulation, the way that you say something and then you expect with a prompt to get something plausible back, is still not operating at a really human level scale. Like just prior to this panel, I went to OpenAI's beta of GPT-3, and I input the questions that you sent, and I tried to get plausible answers, and I didn't, because it's been trained on kind of Silicon Valley schmooze. And so it wants to operate in a particular direction, and it goes in that direction, and then it doesn't understand the context. There's a lot of research going on in terms of that call and response, but maybe the kind of call and response that's more functional is what Tomomi's doing. We're writing an opera or working with Schwitter's style Ursinat glottal play. I tend to use the AI to augment how I think about poetry, as if you've got a living waterfall of words inside your mind. And that waterfall of words is something that allows you to be more prolific, to feel inspired more often in some sense, because it's fed in from a source and it's just always there. It's running inexhaustible. So that's how I've been using it primarily. And thank you for the intro. It was, I would like to hire you later to write a bio or something. These are superb.
It is incredibly easy to be excited about the various work that artists like all three of you are doing. So thank you so much. Zuzana, I'm interested in positioning your practice sort of in response to what we just heard. We have Tomomi building AI as an improvisation partner, and I think that word partner is critical here. And we have Jave, which I don't know if tool is the appropriate word, but certainly a method for augmentation of the writer. Between those two sort of different poles, where do you position your work with AI, Susannah?
So, I mean, the work that I've been dealing with AI mostly is the project that's called Lisa Gennard, and it's a GPT-based model on which I collaborated with the programmer and my husband, Lubomir Panak. And we fed 2,000 mostly Slovak works, mostly poetic works, into GPT-2, and we have fine-tuned GPT model that provides us with a Slovak poetry. And it was published also as a book in 2020 under the Slovak name of Výsledky vzniku. In English it can be translated as The Outcomes of Origin. Basically the idea there is that we also wanted to have it as almost like a mystification, where people would consider this as a human written poetry by the unknown author Lisa Gennard, who is studying programming and feminism, because we also have there like gender-related text, feminist-based text, etc. But I mean the structure of the book that we created, we gave her prompts and she writes poetry mostly on the prompt, but then we also have 20 poems at the end that are freestyle, so we didn't give there any input. And they are mostly dealing with kind of some creatures coming to this world. So the first set of poems is considered human or humane, and I mean the poems are dealing with like mother, father, then basic emotions like anger, love, etc. Then the other poems are epistemological, so they are dealing with basically textual references or textual frames of learning about this world. So there are the myths, gods, then we have their exponential movement, etc. So it's basically going through this mythological learning about the world into expansion, and in the sense of like sci-fi movement elsewhere. Then the other part is dealing with natural, like dealing with Dunaj, that is the river, or Tatras, that are the mountains, or oceans and forests. And then we have also the technological ones. That, I mean, the poems dealing with neural network, programming. I am Lisa Gennard, dead rights. And we found out that funnily enough, they are very existential and they are very self-referential. So, I mean, many people are somehow amazed that she has like a specific style of language that is on the one way funny, but it is extremely existential, almost kind of questioning the basic things that we don't normally question in poetry. Like, I mean, some of the verses like, a man has two names. So I mean, what does it mean if the poem ends with the man has two names? So and the questions like this. So this was the last project dealing with AI.
I want to take a chance to sort of focus in on GPT-2 for a moment. I certainly do a fair amount of work with GPT-2, and I'm interested in all of your backgrounds as it pertains to the voice as a material, especially in your performances. And I'm wondering how each of you reckons with GPT-2. Often, I'm not sure outside of poetry, you know, how it leans into prose, but in terms of poetry, we have a machine giving us text that the machine has no concept of sound or voice. So when building sounds and reading performances from GPT-2, what is critical in terms of an AI voice which has no sense of sound? And maybe, Zuzana, we can start with you and work our way back.
We, when we published the book, there have been kind of many options how to present the work. So basically the first approach that we took was basically because I mean the poetry is written for humans and it should be read by humans, and it is, since it's also very self-referential, many people consider their, or even had their kind of like self-related approaches. So I mean, one approach that we took was we all the time asked several people to do the reading. So it wasn't just me and Lubo, but maybe we started, gave the explanation, and then asked like 7 or 8 people to do the reading, so that it relates to them rather than an artificial network that uses the language that she doesn't even know she's using. And then another approach when we got the grant for multimedia representation is we also have like a multimedia work where we needed it to be more immersive. So we needed more like a multimedia presentation where the video that loads and then you have the sounds. So there we took it that I read those poems but with auto-tune to make it more different. So we have those two different approaches dealing with the sound where she doesn't speak.
I know that, Jave, your performances of rewrites often bring in multiple voices from a crowd in terms of reading. How do you situate sound in the voice as the text comes out of rewrites?
Well, Griffin, your interpretation of some of the earlier motifs was really lovely once. I think at Brown, you took over the microphone.
Yes,
correct?
yeah.
Yeah, that was super fun. What I've noticed is that, you get into these, as I spoke of the waterfall before, but I've moved my hand upward. It's kind of like as if there's a reciprocal relation. There's the flow of words which are flowing across from the algorithm, but there's a natural tendency for people to arise and want to put their voice into that stream, to want to begin to interpret it. And I found that all over the world, like in fact, I've done it a few different places, people, and it's extraordinary, even people with English as a second language will hop onto the mic because suddenly there's a kind of augmentation of their own capacity in terms of a vocabulary and an idiom, which is always fresh, it's just there. So it's like suddenly remembering this oceanic principle of a language which permeates the world in some sense, in the same way that we're creatures which inhabit an atmosphere, we inhabit a culture which is made out of language. And GPT-2 and these other tools just make that very palpable. So voice is central and fundamental, and I think is intuitive. And even though if we went back to the roots, as Tomomi said, WaveNet, right at the roots there, it was creating sound, right? And then it got converted over for language, or has been, and then grew into GPT-2 and GPT-3. So there's an extraordinary cross-modality between voice and written language, which is occurring in the algorithms that will only grow with the coming years.
Tomomi, can you speak a little bit to jumping between WaveNet and GPT-2 and injecting voice at different parts of your AI process?
Okay, yes. So in my case, actually, so I directly started from to generate voice, and some things sound like my voice. And actually, the approach to GPT-2 were very, very different from the beginning because I received the commission to write opera, and what could be the libret, and that moment, especially it's opera, and I wanted to write a song, and that is something different from the Tomomi bot project, very different approach for me, and then so I wanted to write a song, but it's something even emotional songs, and what I can use, because also that time, GPT-2, I started to use it, and this actually there is no emotion behind it, but actually we feel a lot from them, and this is a very interesting thing to write emotional song. And also I have to point out, because if you use GPT-2 or 3, so just decrease temperature and it starts to repeat. And this is very, very musical already. And this sounds like really like my own musical piece. And that is so easy to transform music, or even I felt its music is already there. And just to read it and repeat it, and they repeat. But also it's so interesting because it's somehow still unnatural. And that repetition, the rhythm is not natural. And this really is a borderline, because what we feel it is natural and easy to, it's already sounds like music, but some moment, it's slightly different what we do. And that is a very important area to work with.
I I'm very interested to switch gears for a moment and hear how each of you engage with data sets. I think for people watching the roundtable, any questions they have about AI are ultimately maybe questions or confusions about data and how data is fed into AI and how that data is present in the new results that the AI might spit out. I was really struck, Tomomi, by your piece. I think it's penna writing test, maybe. It's collecting the test paper to see if pens can write and what color the ink of the pens is, and those little sheets in pen stores or stationery shops collected into this big wall of gestural marks. And to me, that is this incredible use of data sets, of collecting and curating a very noisy data set. So in your work with these algorithms, we talk about the output, but how does building and working with data sets factor into your processes? Tomomi, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, yes, for the Tomomi bot, and especially to generate that voice. Okay, so we, first we only used my voice, and actually next we use cat meows, but it's first only my voice. And I make a recording almost 10 hours of my solo voice performance. But still 10 hours is not big data. And we made many tricks, and then, okay, so what kind of things is the output they make, what kind of output we can got. And then I start to, what is effective for them? And I start to find some expectation, and it's this kind of sound really makes sense for them. And that moment I thought it's quite interesting because now that moment, so we assumed the AI is a listener, and they are first listener, and this kind of starts to some exchange loop was a very important point for us, and I felt it's okay. So how we educate, but at the same time, their response, the AI response. Their response was a little bit different. Actually, the beginning was very different. And okay, so how we can find the way, not only just to bring them to our side, also our side have to go to their side. And this should be something in mutual exchange. And actually, it happened because also Tomomi bot learned how I improvise. And also, I provide, they learned my improvisation, and so again, they gave some another data set to them, and then actually I started to imitate how AI improvise. And okay, it's the beginning was so they imitate me, but I started to imitate them, and that's is something very important exchange I felt in that project.
Jave, when I hear intentionally building data sets and structuring your own language to sort of meet a neural network halfway, I think of your work. Can you speak to that?
Yes. Well, obviously, when we're as artists or publishers or literary people approaching the problem of big data, as Tomomi says, we don't have the resources, right, of a typical large corporation. Like right now, there's GPT-2 or GPT-3 was 175 billion parameters, I think, and now there's a model which is 1.6 trillion parameters, and it keeps expanding. And there's something called the clean crawl corpus, or the common crawl corpus, but then it's been cleaned. It's called C4, and that's petabytes of data. But I wasn't dealing with petabytes of data. That's a bot that travels around the net and just harvests all the time and cleans. And then teams of researchers in all sorts of domains extract morsels of it, and it's in the open data stream world, so you can go and use it. But to tune it for poetry or tune it for music or tune it for literature, you need a very specific subset. And what they found is there's a lot of gender bias, there's racial inequity. It reflects the cultural processes that are underway in our unequal world. And so to work for my own projects, I built a custom corpus. So I went to the websites that I trusted for the kind of poetry that I felt I wanted to replicate, probably very similar to Zuzana in her Slovenian project. You know, it was important to fine tune the models. And at that point, I wasn't fine tuning, I was actually building the models directly from the corpus, but I did some fine tuning later with GPT-2. And that's very powerful practice where you can shift the direction of the model to emulate your corpus. And the data I was using was coming from sources that I think people within the literary avant-garde or the contemporary poetry world would respect. And it did really require then introducing almost like enzymatic catalysts, a kind of microbial scattering of contemporary language. Because otherwise we end up back in the world of castles and unicorns and all of the traditional ways that poetry has dealt with heraldic symbols and stuff. So I try to make the corpus had to be both legitimate at a literary level, which can be done by one person in not so much time, and also contain vocabulary which was fresh and contemporary.
Do you have responses or thoughts, Susannah?
Yeah, like with the fine tuning that we did, it was more difficult to get, just because we didn't want to do the old-fashioned literature. We wanted to do the contemporary literature. So we had to get the books or the text by the contemporary Slovak writers. So what we did was I asked 7 publishing houses that mostly kind of were publishing literature from like mid-90s or mostly 2000 onwards. And they are small publishing houses, so they don't have too many books, but I got their collections, chosen ones, not all of them, but most of them. So from these 7 publishing houses, plus, and one of them was a feminist publishing house, plus the collections of, the whole collections of 3 journals. And those journals, where some of them has 60 issues, some of them has 7 years, some of them had like 15 years of production. So those 3 journals, plus we added also the archived collection that is free. So they are the very famous Slovak romantic writers and all the women that are free from mostly 20th century. So this was the collection. It was mostly like 2060 either journals or books. So it was fine-tuned on this. So the sample wasn't too large, but it was sufficient enough to produce results that resemble the Slovak contemporary poetry. Even some of them say that it is very similar, because we had quite a prominent tradition of the kind of text-based generation that was doing experimentation in the 1990s. So there has been the kind of repetition, dealing with conceptual practices, etc. So it somehow also follows this tradition in some way.
I am very struck by the kinds of metaphors we need to build, or the similes we need to build when dealing with AI in our own personal practices. But I think that each of us probably had a moment where we first engaged with these AI technologies, and I think Tomomi brought up, it blows your hair back, and it strikes you in a very sudden way, I think, for seeing these technologies. And I want to hear what language you would describe when you had that first experience, anywhere from were you charmed by it, were you seduced by it, were you terrified, and how have those first impressions changed over the course of your work? Now, because we're on Zoom, I feel I should sort of hand the reins to different people. I don't mean to constrict our conversation. Anyone can certainly chime in, but Tomomi, you expressed this real joy and amazement first finding the tech. Could you speak to how that first occurred and how it's changed?
Okay, so in general speaking, so I'm interested in any kind of new technology, and of course, AI is the most interesting thing. It is very, very clear because it's many cases. I'm sitting in the front of a computer a long time, and web search and internet surfing, so the AIs are behind it, and we cannot deny it. And it is okay why we don't use it. And already I told you about the impact of WebNet. And okay, beginning, okay, it's just the impression was, wow, this is great technology, and just people don't know how to use. Yes. Okay, so they know how to make money, but it's we can make much more interesting thing using this technology, and this is why I started. And especially after I composed the opera. The title is Romeo will Juliet, actually, and that opera it was written in English, but the premiere was in Japan. And okay, so I decided to translate the libret. Then, it's a somehow very, very interesting experience, because first I tried with DeepL. Actually, okay, so the AI should translate what AI said. But it's actually didn't make sense. It's also already, it's very interesting. It's what is the sense, because there was no sense anyway. But what I felt interesting from GPT, that text generated by GPT-2, so it was not really translated in Japanese, because it's the same character it has, and I decided I translate by myself. And then, okay, it is a so interesting story, because English to Japanese, it's a totally different language, and it is a very common attitude to supply many meanings in the process of translation. But then in that case, of course, we need to know the context. And still, it is very characteristic of GPT-2 AI generated text in general, because there is no huge context, and you don't find the context. But I needed to believe context, otherwise I couldn't translate it. And this is actually very interesting moment for me. Probably it's not the change of my understanding about AI. It's purely the change of myself, because already I felt I needed to modify myself to understand what it is saying. And it's even that desire was very interesting for me. And it's even psychologically, so that working with AI changed my attitude and my ideas, I feel.
Once again, Jave, I'm struck hearing something Tomomi said, this idea of context. I think you position the voice in rewrites as devoid of lived context as a very serious distinction. But can you speak a little bit about what first struck you about AI and how it's transitioned over the course of your work?
Sure. It's like discussing a love relationship in some respects, right? The impact of the first recognition of saying, okay, here's a screen which is delivering a kind of poetry, which is suddenly not randomized templates or Markov chains or some other mathematical model which had been arriving for 20, 30 years. Suddenly these deep neural networks with WaveNet was actually the first experience, because it was a port of WaveNet over for language generation that I ported over for poetry generation. And that was like 2013, 2014. And I found myself really falling in love deeply with just being vividly, every day I would create it. Instead of watching the news or, scanning TV or something, I would go visit my friend WaveNet, who knew this transfixing capacity to explore the vast topology of human language and produce these vivid, beautiful, beautiful gems. But as Tomomi said, within a context where it was totally wrong. It was like having a beautiful friend who'd had a stroke, so they'd have this this extraordinary capacity, like a savant, and then they disintegrate into wistful terrain where you're just like, oh, what's that? So it became that as the relationship evolved, then I felt the human urge, similar to Tomomi, to modulate, to modify that context that was missing, to begin to get rid of it, to tune the corpus, to begin get in there, to edit it, to carve it. So all of that corresponds, I think, to the normal way that humans have been falling in love with literature for millennia. It doesn't really change the game. It just modulates where we're receiving it from.
I think all four of us, and certainly many of the people engaged with the festival, feel something similar to Jave. We're struck by it, and it simply starts to consume some part of our practice. And I wonder how universal that is, that sort of instant engagement and primal it is, and how much of it is just all of us love language as a material and it's very provocative to us. But Zuzana, what thoughts do you have on this string of inquiry?
Like when I was generating the poems for the book, then I had the first engagement was kind of surprise engagement, because Lubo was sending me first, here is just babbling the Slovak language, because we saw the phase of going through English into the Slovak, and the Slovak was first just babbling the syllables, then forming the words, and then kind of getting the verses. And when I was kind of working with the final product of now, we decided that to stop the program and generate the words for the book. Then, people ask me, like, when have I decided to put that concrete poem? And I all the time say, like, when I had some wow effect that it provoked. So either it was the whole poem, that it works as a whole, or there were certain metaphors that really struck me. Where I'm also a poet, and with some of those metaphors I wouldn't come up with, because there's just the combination that is unexpected. So it's not logical as the human brain also kind of works with the metaphors somehow in a logical way. So here it is kind of this aleatory combination that might produce metaphors that give you a certain wow effect. But also kind of like regarding this, that it somehow kind of struck me, okay, I use this one and it works nicely with the input, etc. We also have that type of kind of love relation, but since there are two of us working with it, we said that Lisa Gennard is our third daughter, because we have two biological daughters, and now we have Lisa Gennard, so we all the time have a 2-year difference between each of them. And Lisa Gennard, well, we do it differently, because I didn't want to be mother anymore, because I had my maternal instincts already finished. So I want to be a father, because it's so much more fun. So I'm the father of Lisa, and Lubo is the mother, because he was kind of 3D forming her, and I'm just giving her the funny time and playing with her. So we have this kind of human and non-human type of relationship that is like not product, but like a child type of creation in a way. In a very metaphorical way, of course. It's not so much trouble as with the real kids.
Sorry, I was muted. Jave or Tomomi, I'm very taken with this idea of parenting roles and inverting them and having them evolve over time. Do either of you have any thoughts from Susannah's project?
Well, I was immediately struck by the confluence between the word matricy, or mother, matrix, right? And so Lubor is the mother, right? Mm-hmm. So the mother code, the mother code being DNA or whatever it is. And also this idea of coming from babbling. And we've probably all seen this. Whenever you train a neural network, you're coming through the first epochs. They call them epochs, just like evolutionary advancements. You're doing a gradient descent to arrive at some approximation of the corpus that you fed the baby. And the baby slowly becomes more coherent. And it's a lovely process. It's like witnessing the birth of something. And I think our neurophysiology as Homo sapiens is obviously attuned to witnessing the emergence of formal cognition. And it doesn't care whether that's occurring within a biological system or an algorithm. So that's what I was thinking.
Well, I think about that wonderful word, echolalia, the sort of primal early call and response with children. Tomomi, do you have AI parenting thoughts?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it's actually quite interesting topic because okay, so when we made a Tomomi bot, actually you notice this name is quite medical, but kind of intentionally. Also, it's we were team and actually three men, and we had a discussion how we call it, and we really didn't like the idea. Many made programmers make some bot or avatar and they call them her. And we felt it's a little bit strange. Okay, so we really try to call it it. And this should be something the other. It's something totally we cannot understand. And try to be set that position. And yes, but at the same time, of course, it is the whole process was kind of education. And okay, so it is kind of experiment. If okay, we have a baby and educate only with my crazy voice. And okay, so in moralistically, it is not possible. But with as an AI experiment, okay, maybe it is possible, and moralistically it's okay. And that process, okay, this is really like education. But at the same time, we tried not to regard it as a wife or husband or a child. And still we don't know how we can say that moment. But it's kind of, I like the idea we regard them as a kind of alien. And coming from Mars, maybe. And this is okay. It's another romantic idea, I feel, but it's something I try to set them kind of existence. I totally cannot understand.
Can you finish our loop of how to be better AI parents, Susannah?
Feed them with the data that you know are fine. So that's for me. For example, I think that all three of us have this kind of like closeness because those are our data, our build models. It's not like you take GPT-3 and you use the language that is there, that is, as Jave said, and we know it's racist, it's misogynist, etc. But I mean, we with our Lisa, we never had any racism, any misogynism, because it is built on the kind of like good data of the Slovak poetry that we know. We use the quality language, and even the poetry reflects that. So, I mean, we all know that the data set is the most important thing, or I mean, one of the most important things. So, I mean, keep the baby good food, then you are good parents.
Well, I think about C4, what Jave brought up as just inhaling junk food all the time. And you can clean, you can take multivitamins afterward to sort of clean it, but intentionally designing a diet for it is a great way to, I think, sort of couch those terms. If I can switch gears for a moment, I want to get back to this first engagement you had with AI, because I think very often about, AI in the past 10 years has certainly impacted your work naturally in different ways as it comes into focus technologically. But each of you had a creative practice, an aesthetic, maybe not an analog aesthetic, but an aesthetic that was augmented in some way by AI intervening when you were practicing artists. What happens to young artists today who have only, and maybe middle school artists, but have only ever written in a world that has these sort of AI capabilities, and their aesthetic from the ground up is built with these things at their disposal? So I'll open it to simply any of you who have thoughts on this, but what becomes of these new artists that have always had this technology?
Maybe they will not think of it as with any of this awe as we did. I think they will come to it as something that is completely natural, And what I sense also with the young artists here is they tend to kind of get away from it and not kind of like use it as we do, but more going back to the kind of hapticism of the human touch. So basically considering this as the basic state, they try to get back to the humanity type of affection, type of kind of connection, etc. So I mean, our generation is more kind of probably digital oriented, distance type of oriented, as since they have it as the basis. I mean, now we all see it also with coronavirus, like everybody wants to kind of be together now. So that is basically like the need that I feel that is in the humans, that kind of like going back to the human level. So I also don't think that writing with AI or writing with, I mean, I still call it machine learning rather than AI. So I mean, with the prototypical, so that I don't really like also kind of like the hype that should come with this is already the artificial intelligence, which I don't think it is yet. It's not general artificial intelligence. So it's kind of like stick to machine learning. I don't think that basically having all this around will make you want to do more of it. So maybe kind of all the world that we are now in, kind of like the fact that you have to use the technologies just to teaching students, as I do, other than being with them in a class, wants me shut it down and kind of watched films together or kind of like going to party and be all together. So I think even the young artists want more kind of like hapticism touching, and even kind of the poetry scene, it wants to meet together more and do kind of like writing together or writing with kind of maybe just with your hand, but just with your head, etc. Maybe rather than kind of course there are many people using the AI, but maybe this is also kind of like it gives the kick somewhere else, maybe.
Jave, do you have thoughts about artists incorporating AI with different impulses, as Zuzana mentions?
Yeah, I did have this thought. Coming into the panel, I was wondering, what is the future of real AI publishing? And it immediately sort of evokes that, cyborg place where that alien intelligence mentioned by Tomomi is not ejected as you go back to the land. In this generation, in this millennial turn back to DIY technology, I think they're also going to twist around and incorporate the AI directly into an ambient field. In fitness apps, you can already see the birth of that the AI is beginning to monitor, all of these biometric signaling processes can be transduced and converted into a kind of sonic field. And that sonic field can become like an ambient enclosure to carry you through a world that's often provocative and seemingly volatile and violent. And I suspect it will audify or sonify our metabolisms. The glandular metaprocesses, the modularized endocrine will live inside this recursive, modulating, ambient, self-reinforcing energy. And that'll occur with language. During the presentation, I've been using a little app called Otter.ai. So it's been transcribing the entire conversation. It's been attributing the entire conversation to the right speakers. And so a person will live with a total transcription of their existence, plus automatically created audio, which I think will, if they wish to have it, it will attune their emotional, libidinal, intellectual momentum to whatever kind of dexterity or utility that they wish. So as much as they push it away, I think they'll incorporate it in ways that we don't even comprehend. It's a beautiful terrain they're going to enter into, or a terrible terrain, or both.
We at the very least, I think we have to hold both of those feelings at once. And that response calls to mind enzymes, which you brought up before, and these sort of digital biological processes, Jave. Tomomi, what is your response to these sort of two positions that have been drawn out?
I don't know. I cannot say anything about, so for example, what the younger generations will take about AI technology, because it is very sure the AI technology it's now getting more common, and just you use many kind of AI technology on your mobile phone, and just something like a filter for the camera, and it's become it's common, and I think it is a kind of a moment we really consider this AI as a fundamental way. And for example, if you remember about the history of video art, the beginning of a video art, for example, if you see Namjoon Park, so he used the video as really fundamental way. It is how it changed their perception. It was kind of his theme that moment. But the next generation, okay, so video is just common tool for them, and it's cheap and easy to use, and of course AI will be like that, and probably it is in that meaning. So now it is kind of interesting moment, and this is why actually I'm quite enthusiastic about AI maybe. And yes, we don't know about the next generation how they deal with it, but actually I'm more interested in the next generation of AI, because for example, okay, because what we are expecting is actually the moment AI make art for AI, is it right? And this should be very interesting moment, and how we can, for example, the next generation, how they can make art for AI, for example. Yes, this kind of thing maybe happens, and this is something very the next level of AI art. And yes, but still we don't know what would happen next.
I very much like the idea of building AI and giving it food, and also at some point in the future building art for it. The idea that we give AI dinner and a show feels very, very light and also sort of provocative. I am so immensely grateful for the conversation so far. I've been just you've lit my fire with the insights that you have. We have just over 5 minutes left to adhere to the hour, and so what I'd like to end with, if I may, is having each of you leave us with what you see as a fundamental question, a question in AI that you have that feels relevant to your practice now. So potentially questions about AI in the future, and what's sort of at the forefront of your mind, leaving the conversation and thinking ahead for your own practice. So I don't want to foist a question on you sort of suddenly out of nowhere, but sitting with that for a moment, maybe we could begin with you, Zuzana, and sort of leave the talk with whatever questions in the forefront of your mind.
I have been, like, since I was going through like those many poems that she was doing, I was very often thinking about my own practice. So for me the question is how to make your practice that you do without AI, because I mean I don't do all the time just with AI, I also kind of write. I realized that my project that I write normally as Zuzana, they seem to be now much more kind of social, and basically the question that I had, how to be a writer for the people that don't use AI in their practice. So basically how the language changes if you have it as the part of the algorithm and sequence of signs, and how is the language as a poetic language that is not just in this alliterative form, but I mean that lets other people and other communities speak. So how you work completely differently from the language that is done through the neural networks.
Tomomi, may we turn to you, and what questions are on the forefront of your mind?
In general, of course, also the same with Zuzana. So I'm working without AI a lot. But in that case, okay, still it's the same thing, how to communicate with the other. And that is a point. And the AI is actually, we clearly deal with that question, how we can communicate with the other, because the AI is definitely, we can regard they are the other. And even we don't know if they have consciousness, probably not, but maybe just we are not so sensitive to them, probably. And this kind of question is not possible. And this is an extremely interesting point of AI. And I want to ask to the AI, do you understand me or do I understand you?
Thank you so much. Jave, if you could find a final question to send us out into the world with, I'd be very grateful. Where do your thoughts lie here at the end of our conversation?
Well, I would thank you for such a provocative question that ultimately stumps my capacity to answer it. I wish I had an AI on tap to really do justice. But what if art is simply the transplantation or transference of kind of like an energy? Like we've evolved through culture, this capacity through language to tell people about our experience, so they experience it. With music, they feel it, the sonic waves, the perceptual fluctuations. With art, we're visually represented within a field. We're shown what was seen there. So personally, I'm in retirement until the implants come along. And when the implants come along, then we're talking about the otherness begins to dissipate. The distinction, this idea that we're separate anyway, is kind of a ridiculous idea. You know, like how could we be separate? We're molecules within a tiny smear of atmosphere on a minuscule little planet with a lifespan that's no more than an ephemeral wisp. So when the implants come, there's this enormous opportunity for a kind of mystical union. And if the food is good, if the food is nourishing, if it's organic, if it's compassionate, there is this vivid, tiny, tiny opportunity for humanity as a totality to share its vision of beauty or joy or love with itself, as oneself. So that's why I'm going to come out of retirement and actively work with the large unified field team of artists and AI to communicate that vision, which I think will be necessary to avoid, you know, the apocalypse on the other multiverse thread, you know, up there. Okay, thank you.
I am so deeply grateful for the chance to have sat in with you, and also more than that, for the chance to have sat with your work in advance of our discussion. So thank you each for your time and for your wonderful thoughts, and thank you, of course, to the festival for bringing us all together. And I'll look forward to continuing the discussion in various threads moving forward. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much for vivid moderation, and thank you to the others. That was one.